Sasha Alenko here. I help write and produce the Reconnect America podcast. Before we dive into things, I just want to put in a plug for episode 4 of our main series, which we released a couple weeks ago. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, I really recommend you check it out. We put a ton of work into this episode, and we're super proud of the result. The story it tells is full of drama, and it provides a really essential backdrop for understanding the origins of some of the issues that are plaguing the railroad industry today and preventing it from fulfilling its public purpose. In episode 5, we're going to pick up right where episode 4 left off and bring things up to the present moment. To help us make that transition in the coming weeks, we're going to be learning about the present-day experiences of businesses who depend on the railroads to move their freight, by speaking with some of the folks who represent those businesses in negotiations with the railroads and in front of the Surface Transportation Board, or the STB. One of those people is Emily Regis. Emily is president of the Freight Rail Customer Alliance, which, as stated on their website, is an alliance of freight rail shippers impacted by continued unrestrained freight rail market dominance over rail-dependent shippers. Emily is also fuel resource administrator for the Arizona Electric Power Cooperative and president of the National Coal Transportation Association. Now, if you're familiar with Solutionary Rail, you probably know that a large amount of our work has been focused on facilitating a transition away from fossil fuels. So you might be wondering, why are we talking with someone who works on behalf of coal producers and their customers? Well, for one thing, as we highlighted in episodes 2 and 4 of our main series, a large part of the reason why the US was once able to balance the public purpose of rail transport with the need of shareholders to make a profit is because of the principle of common carriage. Railroads once had an obligation to provide reasonable service upon reasonable request to every shipper along their lines. It was only once they began to be allowed to discriminate, demarket, and turn business away that the system ceased to serve the public. Coal shippers have no other option than to move their product by rail, and so they, alongside shippers of a few other rail-dependent commodities, are especially vulnerable to the railroad's ongoing abuse of their market power. But there's another reason why having this kind of conversation is so crucial to the Reconnect America project. One of the central pillars of the vision we're developing here is the idea that when it comes to rail transport, fighting for the public interest is a cause that transcends partisan politics. It's not that we don't have disagreements, but if we can't talk with people that have different perspectives on some things, then we'll never learn enough about them to find out what we have in common. As you'll learn in this conversation, which took place in early October between Emily and Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer, we do have a lot in common. And we also have a ton to learn from people like Emily. When we advocate for a rail system that better serves communities, rail customers are one of the key intermediaries in that relationship. It's their needs that have to be amplified and addressed. The picture that Emily paints in this conversation is one of a rail system dominated by a business model that benefits only the railroads and their shareholders at the expense of their customers. It's a system that has seen cuts to service, a weaponization of surcharges, a suppression of complaints against the railroads for fear of retaliation, and a process to address these complaints that is impossibly bureaucratic and resource-consuming, and not all that helpful even when it succeeds. We discussed the dangers of the pending merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern for shippers that would be left captive to the monopoly power of a single railroad to move their freight. And we considered possible ways to re-envision how we do rail transport in this country. Here's our conversation with Emily Regis.
So it's really great to talk with you. I am very curious about your role and how you came into the work intersecting with rail and rail policy through the electrical co-op work that you do. And so I wonder if we could start with, how did you get into the electric co-op work and what's it like? And then maybe gradually build into helping us understand how it intersects with rail.
Sure. I came to Arizona Electric Power Cooperative. I actually came from other jobs that I'd done. I've worked in the newspaper. I worked for county government. I was just looking for something bigger and better. And we'd moved to this rural area of Arizona near Tucson. And I was working in county government. I wanted to get a better job. So I came in as a legal secretary. And the company at that time was restructuring, splitting into different companies because they weren't going to allow generation and transmission companies to be the same company. You might remember some of that way back. But during that process, I kind of ended up in the fuels department. So, long story short, I ended up doing the coal and rail contract administration. And I just kind of worked in that area, learning different things that were going on. We're kind of in a unique situation as a co-op. And as a co-op, we're a nonprofit rural electric generation and transmission provider. We're actually owned by our members. So they get money back if there's anything left over as part of the company's dividends, I guess if you'd call that. We try to keep their rates as low as possible because most of the people in the rural areas cannot pay the same type of prices for power. And then the large power companies, originally did not want to provide power to rural areas because it costs so much to build all the transmission lines and put up all those poles. And there's many, many miles in between towns versus cities where you've got people living very close together. It's very cheap to put up all that infrastructure. So that's kind of our mission as we try to keep costs as low as possible for our members because they are living in more or less disadvantaged areas. So I started out working in fuels, coal and rail. We had some interesting things going on in the early days. We had some derailments where I had to go out and find cars to replace the cars that were destroyed out of our train set. There was a strike at the main coal mine where we were getting our coals. So through that process, we had to figure out a different way of getting coal, different mines, trying different blends of coal. And then that mine shut down. And I think late 1990s, early 2000s, we had to figure out where we're going to get our coal from. And at that time, coal was fairly cheap. It was definitely cheaper than gas. And we had two 195 megawatt gas-fired units at our power plant. And we needed to keep below our regulations. We had all kinds of considerations, environmental regulations to consider. So we started playing around with different blends of coal and getting coal from Colorado and coal from PRB, which is the Wyoming region, and New Mexico. In fact, at one time, we were taking all three because we could blend those coals and get the best advantages out of the economics and their inherent qualities so that we could comply with the regulations and still have an affordable fuel. So we just had a complex book of where we're getting our supply from, working with all these different railroads, working with BNSF and the UP. Then we had a short line come in to part of the route that delivers coal to us. So that was complicated. Just all these different things, more derailments, more cars, had to lease cars, find different ways to get more train sets during times when there was huge demand for train sets and nowhere to be found. You couldn't find rail cars, you couldn't lease them, you couldn't steal them, nothing.
You tried.
Yeah, we tried, but we built cars and shared a train set with another company for a while. I mean, just trying to find all kinds of creative ways of dealing with our own problems. And so through all that, I was also attending these industry conferences put on by the National Coal Transportation Association, the NCTA. And I started to get involved with the board, and I've been president of that board now for some time. So it's just been a really rewarding experience to be involved with all these different people because they're all doing the same jobs like what I'm doing. There's coal producers and rail car companies, and you go to these meetings and you get to talk about all this stuff and everybody's, sharing information. It's just a great, great networking opportunity. I mean, that's the definition of networking to me because I've been helped so much by these people, these meetings in the industry who are doing similar jobs to mine, and you just learn a tremendous amount. Plus, they bring in great speakers. So through that effort, I then also got involved with Freight Rail Customer Alliance. That's the other group I'm president of now. Used to be called CURE, Consumers United for Rail Equity. And about 10 years ago, that changed hands and we rebranded. And that group really works more on the legislative side, trying to advocate for shippers who are captive to railroads and to find ways to create more fairness in the process of getting better rates for shippers. So that's how I got involved with working with the committee at the STB, the Surface Transportation Board. STB is the only government agency that has any jurisdiction over the railroads. They can do rulemakings, and they have various rules and processes that govern how the railroads operate. I think the railroads wish they didn't have that at all. I mean, they're always trying to push back on anything that the STB does or tries to dictate to them. And so there's been many, many processes of rulemakings that these groups that I'm involved in have participated in to advocate for shippers' rights, to give shippers a voice, because I said before that a lot of shippers are kind of afraid to speak out, to let their railroads know that, hey, they're complaining about them over here to the STB because they're afraid of retaliation in some way. I think that would be really difficult to prove that. But again, it's that kind of group that just wants to have the strength in numbers and be part of these associations that can submit a letter or participate in a petition or something on their behalf. So I just thought it was kind of an interesting process and got involved. And I'm not afraid to go up there and speak on behalf of shippers and talk about what's fair and what's right and what should be done and what we need, because the railroads are always up there talking about what they want. For sure they are. So I've just kind of enjoyed that aspect of being the voice and an advocate for shippers' rights and shipper issues. And also maybe a little bit of educational aspect to what I'm doing for the Surface Transportation Board members, so they understand what it's like to be a shipper. They come from all different areas onto that board, and a lot of them aren't shippers. They've never been shippers. So I think it's important to keep them informed on how things really work, what it's really like. So I can do that because I've had all this experience in contracting with railroads, contracting for coal, finding rail cars, leasing cars, maintenance of cars. I'm involved with the fly ash part of it as well. You know, the used coal becomes a product that is also marketable. So that's where I came from. And that's how I got here.
It's really cool. And I can see how when you get together with in a conference with all of these people who are taking on different aspects of this system, I think a lot of us can relate to the fact that we get to finally have conversations with people that understand the world that we operate in, and that maybe our spouses or friends don't want to hear anymore about, you know, are a little bored by when we nerd out on our topic of obsession. So you have an interesting perspective on a commodity that I have been under the impression, perhaps partially misimpression, that was a protected commodity. There are a lot of commodities after the Staggers Act that were exempted from common carrier obligation, or the obligation to provide reasonable service from the railroads. But wheat, coal, crude oil, and some hazardous materials are some of the few that are not exempted. But the way you talk about it, it sounds to me like it's not quite that simple. It's not that your guaranteed service and carloads of other things are not guaranteed service. And so I wonder if you could delve into that a bit and maybe help those of us who are not deeply ingrained in the difference between common carrier and contract carrier. How does that play out for a non-exempted commodity like coal?
Yeah, well, it's true. We're in that category, a coal commodity. You can use the common carrier pricing authority and operate your business through the tariff system, which is something you can ask for and they have to provide. It can be a rate that you don't know what it's going to be. It could be anything. And I know this because our company's been through the process 3 different times since I came to work here of seeking a rate prescription through the Surface Transportation Board process. It's called the standalone cost test. And in order to do that, if you're unhappy with the rates that you're getting from the railroad, you can go through this case. It's an actual case that you build that shows, hey, we're being treated unfairly. We shouldn't have to pay that much. We should pay this. And here's the theoretical railroad that we've put on paper that shows why that's right. And in order to go through that process, you have to get out of your contract and go on the common carrier pricing authority. The contracts don't really look that much different from the tariff. There's not a whole lot in there that you can negotiate. They pretty much say, well, here are your terms and here's your rate. And oh, here's a rule book that because you're shipping from this region, this rule book governs everything to do with PRB. So everybody who's shipping in that region, they got the same rules as you do on how much time you can hold your train at the mine or how long you can keep it at the plant unloading it, or just various rules that govern how it's operated. And all you're doing is providing rail cars, and they're using their equipment and their people to pick it up and move it. So you can either use their equipment, which there's very little of really. They don't have a lot of rail cars. So they're kind of already spoken for. There's very few of them. Or you can lease your own cars, or you can own your own cars. So you provide this to the railroad, they give you a rate. And your contract really doesn't have anything like a service standard that says you'll get your shipments in such and such time, or you'll get all of your nominated tons. It does have certain rules that you have to nominate your volumes by a certain time. But then there's nothing that comes back and says, well, if we don't deliver it to you, you're entitled to. It doesn't say that at all. You're not entitled to anything. I mean, if they somehow mess up and don't give you all your tons or deliver, there's not much you can do.
And that's under the common carrier obligation rate?
That's under the contract. And I believe the common carrier obligation also does not have really a service standard that promises you or guarantees you any certain delivery time frame. So again, it's just tell them your volume, when you need it, where you need it from, here's the equipment, and hope for the best. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like they're messing up all the time. There's, for the most part, they really do try and are successful at delivering the volumes because it's money to them. Sure, they want to deliver the volumes. If they don't deliver your volumes, they don't get paid. So yeah, they want to deliver. But when there's a lot of demand and everyone is asking for the same thing and demand from different commodities, like when we came out of the pandemic, there was a lot of demand for different things. And it was kind of a big service meltdown. And people weren't getting their coal, and a lot of other things were not getting delivered because it just was too much too fast, and they weren't expecting it, and they didn't have enough people, and they didn't have enough power, and so forth. So that was something you couldn't really do anything about except go to the STB and complain about it. And they did have some hearings on it, and we did go and testify at those hearings as shippers. But in the end, what do you get out of it? You can sue them. You can say, oh, you cost our company millions of dollars because we had to go and burn gas, or we had to buy all this power because you didn't deliver the coal that we contracted with you for. And that can go well, or depending on how you do that process, it could take a long time. But that's what you have to turn to if you're a contract shipper and you don't get your tons. You can sue for it, I guess. But common carrier doesn't really give you much better, but it does allow you to seek this rate prescription process through the various STB rate relief processes that they have, which are not many, and they're very expensive and take a very long time.
So just before we go into the rate relief, because I think that is very interesting and important, I think I would like for you to describe those impacts of when you do not get service at your utility in a timely way, and describe the difference between what it costs you to, say, burn coal versus burn gas, and how the service impacts the cost to the utility and how that impacts your customers.
Sure. Yeah, as coal shippers, utilities maintain inventory. We're probably the only commodity out there that just actually buys extra commodity for inventory and puts it on the ground. Probably industry standard is something like 40 days of inventory on the ground at your plant in the event that you aren't going to get your shipments or something happens. You're guaranteed at least that long of a stockpile that you can burn until you get your next train load if it takes that long. So you maintain the stockpile of inventory. You're counting on deliveries to continue to replenish that stockpile and keep your units full. Say if you're base loading your unit and you're going to burn coal, and that's the cheapest fuel right now, and you don't have anything else, or maybe you don't have access to anything else. There's plants that don't have gas, don't have solar, or maybe coal is the only thing. What could happen is if you're just not getting enough deliveries, you take too much off the pile, eventually you're going to run out, and you get to a point where, okay, now you're in a deficit, you have to do something. You can buy power, which could be very expensive, Or if you can burn gas, maybe the price of gas might be 2, 3 times cold, depending on what's going on. And so now your rate structure has shifted to this very expensive remedy to replace the fuel that you were counting on or that you had contracted for. So what you might do, you can try to curtail the unit when you see your pile getting down into a dangerously low days of inventory. Maybe you only got 10 days left. And well, maybe during the times of the day when it's not so cold or not so hot, you could maybe curtail a little bit and do something else to ease the pain of, I mean, you just don't want to run out. I mean, you cannot run out. And we have all kinds of rules about reliability on our business. There's FERC and there's NERC, and you have to have these, run plans and preparedness plans you have to submit and show that you're ready for summer and you can meet the demands, and you're always planning for resources. So interesting, though, that we have to rely upon a transportation delivery service that is not so reliable sometimes and doesn't have to be.
Right.
Doesn't have to be.
Which is fascinating because from the early days of railroad, it has been treated like a quasi-utility. And for a long time, it was regulated more tightly to create the kind of reliability you're talking about.
And that's when they got out of the Staggers Act, when railroads were losing too much money and going bankrupt. And they came up with the Staggers Act as a way of taking away regulation and letting the free market handle itself, which they've done very well with. They've done great being able to do contracts and earn their own cost of capital back. And it's worked out really well. You don't see a lot of railroads going bankrupt anymore, for sure.
No, that's the cost of capital, and revenue adequacy does not seem to be an issue these days. They're record profits and Wall Street's loving it.
That's right.
But the consequence on even a protected commodity like yours is that you do not get the same sort of reliability. So when we talk about common carrier obligation and the need to clarify what it even means, when you testified before the Surface Transportation Board or others, how does this common carrier obligation figure into your testimony?
It's true that it does have a rather vague meaning, and it's not necessarily enforced anywhere. You don't see the Surface Transportation Board penalizing the railroads for anything like service failures. I mean, the worst they've done is summon them all to Washington and making them sit in a room for 2 days and grilling them over their issues and, wasting time, I guess, making for some really contentious hearings. But we would like to see some reciprocity in there. If they're not holding up their end of the bargain, then there should be consequences and they should be enforced. Maybe there should be higher penalties that come out of the STB for service failures. But we've got this problem with not being able to bring a case to the STB unless we're under a common carrier tariff, because we can't bring a case if we're under a contract because contracts are confidential. So we would like to see maybe some language attached to common carrier obligation so that when you enter into a contract with a railroad, you can point to that as they do when they point to their own little rule books that say you must not exceed 5 hours of loading, or you must make your cars available in such and such time, or we charge you demurrage. Some kind of reciprocity process that makes it fair is what we're really looking for. We want a level playing field, just like everybody else.
Yeah, it seems like that fairness is pretty basic. So if the common carrier obligation was clarified and there was reciprocity and sort of standards for service, that would potentially make it more attractive to use the common carrier rate. But would it do anything to protect contracted carriage?
Yeah, I'm not sure how we would work that out. There might have to be actual regulation. I mean, no, they hate that word, but there might have to be some rules about the railroads, how they will operate, and something that has to be used in the contract language for shippers. I don't know any other way because you do have some advantages with a contract. You can negotiate a few small things. You can perhaps work out a few things. So you want to be in a contract. I think there's advantages to having that rather than doing the common carrier pricing authority. As I mentioned before, that's public. Anyone can see that. It's published. So you don't necessarily want your competition and other, the coal producers and everyone to be able to see what your railroad rates are.
Can they compete with you in some manner that when they see your costs, they know how much then your overhead is? And
Oh, yes. They can figure out, how far they can push you with negotiations to get the most they want out of it because, I can see you're only paying, yeah, you're paying $10 for your rail rate. And if we charge this for your coal, you're still going to be able to beat gas or you're still going to be lower than this guy. Then they'll know the whole big picture. Well, you don't really want them to know that. You shouldn't have to share that information. And so if it's public, what are you going to do? So you prefer to keep it confidential. So there's benefits to having it confidential for sure. But there should be, I think, some way of the STB attaching some rules or regulations. If I ask for rail service and that's the only service I can get to ship my commodity, I should get it. I shouldn't be told by the carrier, well, you didn't tell us last June yet that you needed these tons, and so we don't have time to get it for you now, sorry. Or, they have all these kind of requirements. Well, you must tell us by July 1 the volumes that you're going to be shipping in the next year. And so you try to do that and you might be off. And so you may not have the right number at that time. You don't know. The market changes, everything changes so fast. And so they want to hold you up. Well, you told us this volume number as your nomination, and now you're changing your mind. Now you need more. Well, it's difficult for them. Yeah, they got to find more people and power. And they like to operate very skinny. Like they don't want to just have a bunch of people sitting around and power sitting around. They got to keep it all moving. And they want this really efficient, they call it precision scheduled railroading. You probably heard that term. The business model that most of the class ones have adopted is that they really want to get the most efficiency out of every unit and every hour and every day. And so that's what that's all about, is they prefer not to have extra labor, extra power. So if you're not able to give them a very good forecast, and they complain about this all the time, well, the shippers didn't give us a good forecast and then they ran out, so it's their fault. So wait a minute, you're the only source for our delivery. We can't move it by truck. We can't get it any other way. It's not our fault that these things happen. We needed coal. We told you in as much time as we could, and we'll work with you. Plus, we have inventory. We got a huge pile over here, but we need more, and we need it delivered by this and this time. So it's a great opportunity for the railroads when things like that are going on, and they'll say, okay, we got too many shippers asking for additional volumes that we weren't counting on, so we're going to just have to cut everybody back. So we're going to take a train away from you and a train away from you. And that way it's fair. Everybody's getting something that they need. I mean, they won't cut you off completely, but they will just make everybody suffer and get less than they really need.
While they are buying back stock and delivering dividends and making billions of dollars a year in profit and being treated as a quasi utility, but they're really critical national infrastructure that people rely on for their food, for their power, for clean water, and everything else.
Oh, absolutely. And they can charge more too. There's nothing stopping them from saying, okay, Emily, well, we see you're really in a bind there and you need another train set. Well, we've got a train set you can have, and that will help double up your deliveries, but it's going to cost you this. So, but you can't go and lease your friend's train set over here that's parked, because that's parked. We're not going to move that train. But you can have our train. They do stuff like that all the time, which is kind of irritating because we all are connected. Like I said, we have great network and we know someone who's got rail cars and we've used them before and it works really well. It's in the system, but no, if they really control how these things play out.
And why won't they let you use your friend's rail cars?
Well, because that means they gotta take it out of storage, they gotta pick it up and power it, and they'd prefer to use something that's already moving, maybe their own cars, or they don't want to add to the congestion problems that they already have. So if they've restricted somebody else's train, it doesn't mean that you can use it. You just got to get in line and see what they can give you. It's just really very frustrating problem, because when you when you're running out of coal and there's equipment parked, but they're just not willing to add equipment because they can't find the people. They don't have enough people. They've got everybody working double shifts and they don't have enough locomotives or something. And they've got congestion problems because they add more cars to the system, things just slow down and don't work as well for anybody. So they do kind of pick winners and losers in a way because they may have a really huge customer that has a lot of clout, and it just comes down to maybe your relationship with the railroad and what strings you can pull or how loud you can complain to the STB. I don't know if that helps anybody really. I've tried that myself and I didn't see that it really resulted in better service or better anything, but I tried it.
There's a few things that are coming up for us that we'd like to get more information on. You have a very concrete experience with PSR, precision schedule railroading, and it would be very interesting to hear more about that. I mean, you've already described, but it's nice when it comes from your voice, not mine, about why do they have not enough people? Why do they have not enough cars out there? What are they cutting in order to create that environment where there's a scarcity and the impact of that scarcity is on you? So I want to hear more about that. And then I would like to actually get into this complaining to the STB and rate relief, those 3 tries that you made. I'd love for people to hear that story. And after that, maybe that would be a good time to mention how the STB tried to make a rate relief easier with final offer rate review, but that was vacated by a court. So in thinking about that kind of trajectory here, could you speak a little bit more about what your take is on what exactly is precision scheduled railroading?
It's doing less with less. Really, it's just making things more efficient for the railroad. It didn't really result in making things better for the shippers, but it saved a lot of money because, as I said before, you don't have a lot of people just waiting around to be called up. You don't have equipment parked here and moving empty there, and you're keeping track of every mile and every locomotive, and all the power is doing something. It's making money. So it's all about making money and reducing all the waste. So that's probably a model that everyone would like to have, right? If you were running a business, you would prefer to have it run efficiently. So I don't pretend to know all the details of how that works in a railroad business, but the way it works for a shipper is just exactly what I said. There's fewer people available and there's fewer locomotives. And when the railroads, most of the class ones started adopting this, and I think BNSF might be the only one who didn't actually, or said they weren't doing PSR, but maybe they were doing some kind of model based on that. Right before the pandemic and the couple of years leading up to 2021 or so, 2020, they were letting a lot of people go. There was a big reduction in labor, 30%. And I think we've shown this in some of our testimony at the STB and different slides that we've done. So they let labor go, and pandemic came along, no big deal. There wasn't a lot of stuff moving. Things were pretty flat, not a lot of demand. And then boom, early 2021, things started roaring back. A lot of demand for stuff, kind of unprepared, things that you weren't expecting to hear in demand suddenly. And they didn't have enough people and they didn't have the equipment ready to go. They were just really caught up short. And so that created congestion because things were just moving slowly. And so everybody wanted to put their train sets in place and keep them moving. And that's when they started, picking out trains and arbitrarily saying this person has to park a train and you have to park a train. And you can't have 5 trains moving. You can only have 3, things like that. So it was really hampering the shippers' ability to move the commodities that they wanted or that they needed to keep their operations and their businesses moving. So that's what happened with PSR. And I believe they still use PSR. We've called it out many times because it's a business model that only benefits the railroad. It doesn't really benefit the shipper. What do we get out of this? Do we get better rates? Because you've saved so much money on your operations and now you've maintained everything to the lowest level. Well, where's our rate cut? Why can't we get a piece of that? But we don't. We're always getting rate increases. I think I can speak for most people on that. So you don't see where it benefits you. And they continue to make more money on lower volumes. This is a way for them to not have to grow their business, not to have added volumes, but they continue to make the revenues that they've promised their stockholders and shareholders.
You use the word efficiency, and it's a very slippery word because it means different things to different people. Efficiency for them is cost cutting. Efficiency in your business, I imagine, has a different meaning.
Right. I mean, for coal shippers, we get coal trains all the time. I mean, you're just running them round the clock and they just go back and forth the same route in the same cycle. But there's a lot of like manifest shippers and other types of shippers that maybe they get their deliveries 5 days a week, or they've got a small plant and they can only take so much of a delivery at a time. And then they get cut back to 3 days a week. So they're not really getting the deliveries they need on the days they need it. Or they have a bunch of empty cars that are just aren't getting picked up because we told you're not getting service now except these days of the week instead of every day. So that could be an issue. So you know, a glut of empty cars not getting picked up, deliveries not coming on the days that you need them. That's what I understand is an impact to a manifest shipper or some other type of shipper besides coal. Because what they'll do with coal is they'll just put your train somewhere on a siding and not move it. And then when they have a crew, they'll crew it and bring it. So instead of taking 7 days to bring it to you, it might take 10. So you just have these erratic cycle times, unpredictable cycle times.
You talked about complaining to the STB. Could you tell the story of the 3 attempts?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, I'll mention that the STB has an Office of Public Assistance where you can call and they will make calls on your behalf to the railroads and try to convince them or persuade them to remedy some service problem that you're having. And it may work for some folks. I don't know. I've called a couple times when I got really frustrated with service. And I'm just not sure it did anything except upset the railroad representatives. Like, oh, Emily, why did you call them? You can just talk to us. And I said, well, I got to a point where I didn't think anything was happening, so I thought I'd get some more help. But that's just one aspect of what the STB can offer you as far as help. The other is if you're frustrated with your rates and you feel you're paying too much and you're being treated unfairly, and you have these various case processes you can take to the STB to try to get some relief on that. So our company, in fact, even in the days before I even came to work here, started one rate case process way back, I think in the maybe early 90s or something. It took a very long time because what you're doing is you're building this theoretical railroad. It's called a standalone cost test railroad. And you present that. It has to have all the expertise. You have to hire consultants. Maybe you've got an expert in railroad ballast or an expert in railroad track, or you have to map it out realistically on a real map. Like, okay, if we took this railroad route and we moved it here, and instead of going through this area, we went this way. So here's all the commodity and revenue that this railroad would get if they did this. You have to put it all together as if it's really going to work. And then the railroad will come back and dispute those things, and they'll come up with their cases why that wouldn't work. So as you can imagine, this goes back and forth for a very long time. It can take years. And so you're spending a lot of money on attorneys and consultants, and you're hoping that it will go through to the point where maybe you'll get a win and the STB will say, here is your rate. Railroad, you must not charge this company more than this, and this is what it has to be. And they were right and they proved you wrong. Here it is. Well, we did that 2 times. I think in the first case, it went on for so long that so many rules that changed, and we got different chairmen at the STB. I wasn't here then, but I think it got thrown out finally, like on a technicality or something, as well, you can't use this anymore because that's not part of the rules. The second time we did it, I was involved very much with the whole thing. It took many years, and then kind of same thing happened. The rules changed. We ended up with a case that kind of just got, you can't do that. You can't use this case. So the third time we did it, it took about 4 years, I think, and we were successful. And we did get a rate prescription, and we did get to enjoy that for about a 10-year period, and it was retroactive. But then all during that time that we were involved in this process with the rate case, we had to use the Common Carrier Pricing Authority rates, which are public and which you have no say in. I have to say they weren't that much different than maybe what we would have been paying. under a contract, but they were still, again, on the Common Carrier Pricing Authority. And we didn't really want everyone to have access to them, but that was our only way of being able to go through the process. So I would say, it was successful for us. And then we came into the time, towards the end of that 10-year rate prescription period, when we were starting to suffer a lot of environmental regulations and new rules about coal. And coal was, it's going to be difficult to be burning coal anymore. And, about the war on coal. I'm sure you've heard of that in the Obama years. And we've really been through the woods as far as that goes. But we're still burning coal. We're not in any kind of rate case. We probably wouldn't seek one because the future is really so uncertain for coal these days. You don't know how long you're going to have your coal unit. You don't have many, many, many years of life for the unit on the one hand. On the other hand, you're not guaranteed being able to burn coal at all because, hey, while we're getting beat up by the regulations, the coal producers, they're also getting twisted around, and you got shippers that, cancel the contract. We don't want it. No, wait a minute. We need a lot of volume. Suddenly they come in and try to get so you got this pushing and pulling all the time with the producers as well. And then on the other hand, now you've got the railroads trying to predict or operate their business based on this kind of erratic, uneven demand model where, who knows, next year could be a big year for coal. We don't know. I mean, Trump has changed a lot of rules and maybe coal's going to have another heyday. I mean, I did not predict and did not expect in 21 and 2022 and even most of 2023, the demand for coal was so high and gas was so expensive and people were trying to get as much coal as they could. And then suddenly all at once, it kind of just dropped off the map and gas was cheap again. And it's like, oh no, we don't want that coal now. Let's just back off. So it's a very fickle industry. So it's tough for everybody. So you just can't guarantee that the coal producers are going to be around. I mean, they're not sitting around waiting for you to show up and buy coal. They got to produce coal based on their contract system as well. I mean, they are there to make money. So they want to know what you're going to be buying, and it's being produced for you all the time. It's not like it's just a big pile sitting there waiting for you to pick it up. So every part of this business has its own quirks and ins and outs for sure.
So what happens with the rate review process? Like you described how onerous it is because you have to prove that it's a fair rate, but you have to basically build this model railroad on paper. So what did the STB try to do to address the difficulty of the rate review process?
Well, I think they tried to come up with various ways to shorten the process, maybe for some smaller shippers that maybe wouldn't have to go through such a long, onerous, expensive process. They also did some kind of process where you could come in and maybe it's final offer rate review where, they participate in the negotiation process with you and is sort of helping you out to get both parties something that they needed. And I believe that's the one that the courts decided, no, you don't have the authority. You can't have that.
Wow. So this brings up this issue of what does the surface transportation have the authority to do or not do? It's pretty discouraging if they pass something around reciprocal switching or this final offer rate review, and then a court can say, no, you don't have the power to do that. I've learned in the last few days that in this 2026 surface transportation reauthorization or legislation that has to happen, that it's possible that there will not be any section covering rail and the STB, that there will be no rail title, which just honestly, in a moment like this, when we're faced with the largest merger in history, and the courts are threatening the minimal expressions of power that the STB has tried to assert, how is it possible that it's in the public interest, shippers' interest, and in the interests of our economy to totally exclude and ignore the problems with their rail system? How does that make you feel to hear that?
I just find it very frustrating. We've been going through the times here where practically every decision Trump has put out has been challenged by the court. Some little court over here decides, oh, no, you can't deport those people and you have to bring them back. What power and what say do they have over the president of the United States? So take that and shift it over to the STB and say, okay, what are they supposed to be doing? If they're not allowed to set rules, if they're not able to come up with these rulemakings that provide shippers with some mechanism to get fairness for their rates, I mean, what are they supposed to be doing? We're all scratching our heads saying, all right, we've got these two railroads that say they're ready to merge and they want to do this merger, and they're talking about it like it's done, like it's a done deal. And we're like, well, wait a minute, there's a process and it's through the STB and you have to let that play out. And there's very specific rules that they're going to follow in their evaluation of this merger. And it's going to take some time. And there is no other entity that can just step up and say, yeah, that's done. That's going to happen. We're already doing it. You hear them talking like, oh, who's going to be next? Well, okay, BNSF and the CSX, they could be the next to merge. Like, wait a minute, you can't talk about these things as if you can just do whatever you want. So we would really like to see at least this process follow the rules and have the STB do its job. And at the same time, we would like to continue to try to come up with various petitions and rulemakings that help shippers or protect shippers. Even if they're going to get thrown out, we're still going to try because we don't have any other agency that has any jurisdiction. Where else are we going to go? All we can do is keep trying this, even though, some of the things they came up with, the reciprocal switching, wasn't really great for everybody. It's not what we wanted anyway, but it was something. We did have this one petition. It's called Petition for Private Rail Car. It is supposed to provide some reciprocity for those of us that own our own equipment, that we get to have a say in what happens to that equipment. And if the railroad abuses it or takes too much time in using it, or they don't give it back to us, various things that we should be able to bill them, just like they would bill us for some demurrage. This is called reverse demurrage, that we get the opportunity to get some money back for unfairness, how they've used our own equipment. So we think that's reasonable. In any other business, you would probably have that. We should have some choices. We should be able to use, if we're not getting along with the BNSF or the UP, isn't there a way for us to work with another railroad, perhaps? As unrealistic as it sounds for a coal shipper in the West, but there's lots of shippers in the East that could conceivably make this work for themselves because they have lots and lots of options and lots of railroads to choose from. When you start consolidating all the railroads, then you don't have any competition, do you? Even for those people.
Right. If you consolidate all the railroads, you don't have any competition. You mentioned at the very beginning this idea that the transmission and generation co-ops were going to be vertically separated, transmission from generation. And I'm not sure how that exactly did play out.
I think it only played out in Texas and it didn't work in other states, and it eventually didn't happen. It didn't happen in Arizona. We were anticipating it, but it didn't work.
Interesting. Yeah. One of the things that I'm very interested in, and maybe even for a future conversation, is the relationship between transmission and power generation. I'm very fascinated by how the need for transmission could help stabilize the grid, and where there are a variety of generation assets, the ebbs and flows of the generation could be lessened and the spikes in needs could be addressed by having a more efficient transmission system. So that's probably a future conversation.
I see what you're saying. I mean, it was all built at different times, and it's not necessarily a throughput connection. And, Texas has its own system, doesn't access the outs, very little of it does anyway. I don't work in transmission, but I understand that there is a lot of issues with the reliability of this system that's getting very old, and it's really not a one-size-fits-all system where what works in the East doesn't necessarily work out West. And the whole marketability and fairness and confidentiality issue of a transmission provider and a generation provider being the same company shouldn't matter, because you're still providing service to your own customers in your own section of the grid. But again, I couldn't really speak on broad terms.
But you're also highly regulated.
Yes.
And so, unlike the railroads, you have to dot a lot of I's and cross a lot of T's to do your business. My mind goes in a few directions here, but you spoke to petition. So the petition is to the STB. I am assuming that you're making that petition, but isn't it to Congress and things like the Reliable Rail Service Act or the bill that was in the Congress some years ago, the 8649, around reverse demurrage and clarifying common carrier obligations, making sure that expanding reciprocal switching or removing exemptions, revoking exemptions from commodities, affirming the authority of the Surface Transportation Board so that their rules aren't overturned in court. Doesn't that actually have to happen through Congress?
Yes, that is something that we've pushed for some years. The last time the STB was reauthorized was 2015, I think. And so much has changed, and there's so much more that we need to add to the language of the reauthorization. As soon as it got done, it was almost time to change it again. So I agree, we need the Reliable Rail Service Act. We need these things, but we need people in Congress to focus on it and pick it up and take it to the floor and vote on it. They can't even keep the government open right now. They're really bogged down in so many other things. This is pretty low on their priority list.
It's a shame.
It's a shame. With the Republicans in power, you would think that something like this could get done, but the Republicans are really very sympathetic to the railroads. So the railroads kind of own the Republican Congress. And it's when the Democrats are in power, they are much more sympathetic to shippers, maybe not necessarily coal shippers, but shippers. But even with that, we didn't get very far with it. So you really need a champion, someone who is in a good seat and a good position to pick these things up and get them moving and get some signatures on there and some support for it. You would think when things happen like that Ohio derailment with the Norfolk Southern train and East Palestine, where there's the derailment and the explosion and the toxic fumes and all that, you would think that would get the attention, especially, someone like J.D. Vance, he's from Ohio, right? Couldn't he have helped? I think he was part of that at one point, but it is a lot of work to try to get these things going somewhere. Everybody's got their own little issue they're trying to raise a flag on. And I just don't know that our voices are loud enough or we got enough people in the right places. Freight Rail Customer Alliance is really a very small organization. We do have a lot of industry members, but it's really kind of a handful of people in the leadership. And Ann Warner does most of the work herself. And so you look at that. There's other shipper groups like the Private Railcar Food and Beverage people, and then the Knit League. All of us are kind of saying the same thing, trying to get some of the same things done as much as we can. But as far as STB goes, we've never had a better board. This has been an excellent board. We're so lucky to have Patrick. I mean, he's done such good things. He's a very smart guy, Patrick Fuchs, and he's doing his best, I think, with what limited power he's been given. And even when we come to them and say, we would like to see this happen, we would like to see a rulemaking on such a, and they're like, do you think the STB has that power? Sometimes I'm not sure they know what power they have because they're asking us like, okay, do you think we have that? So, and as you see, even stuff that made it as far as, they put out this rule and then the court just said, nah, can't have it, can't do that.
What's your experience with Chair Fuchs that gives you that sense that he's listening and wants to deliver?
Well, I've been on this committee, the Rail Energy Transportation Advisory Committee, for some years now. I just got reappointed for another term. This is a biannual meeting where energy shippers from all walks of life of energy, like, the petroleum and the coal and biofuels. And we sit in a room with the railroads and the board, the ST board members, and we listen to each other's issues and perspectives. And we talk about problems and everyone gives a little presentation. And Patrick, is a very good listener, asks great questions. He's very fair-minded. I think he's very organized. The thing he just put out here recently, the rulemaking, where he wants to remove the required reporting on positive train control, but then he's going to propose 2 new rail service metrics to collect data on spots and pools and some other operational rail metric. And he did come out and say, they wanted to get rid of unnecessary data reporting. Like, there's no need to just collect data for the sake of collecting data. They want to collect data that they're going to look at and use, and that's going to give them information that they need. And so he's smart enough to figure that out, that, there's recognize the faults of maybe a previous administration for handling it a certain way and collecting too much data for the wrong reasons. And what do we really want to see? And he's great for asking for input. He did have that committee earlier this year where they were just asking shippers to meet with his committee and talk about ways that they can be more efficient, and how are they going to meet the objectives of this new administration. So we participated in that. And I have to say, for myself, with my leadership role for the NCTA and the Freight Rail Customer Alliance, when I first started going to those meetings, those RETAC meetings at the STB, I realized that we didn't have any of our own data. We were sitting there, and the railroads have all this stuff about their efficiency and how many carloads they moved and what they delivered and volumes and blah, blah, blah. But what do we have except inventory? We can just sit there and say, well, we had inventory, we had this, we had that. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we had our own kind of on-time performance data? Like, what are you experiencing in your shipper or your railroad performance? And so we do this survey now every quarter of all our members, and we collect that data and we put it in slides and we share it with the STB. And it's just a snapshot in time of maybe a random sample of shippers, most, coal shippers, of what they're experiencing and where it's happening. Is it on the UP? Is it on the BNSF? Is it PRB shipments? Is it Illinois Basin? Were your cycle times good? Did you get the coal that you nominated? Do you blame the mines? Is that why you didn't get your coal? I mean, just various questions. We try to keep it simple, and we just collect this data for ourselves just so we have something. And then we're not just relying on the railroads to tell us everything. I mean, I know they collect an awful lot of data for themselves that they could share, but they don't always share.
They're only going to share the data that serves their story. So you better be collecting your own data. That's a very savvy move.
It spawns some pretty interesting conversations sometimes, because you get some questions out of the board like, well, really? Wow, why is this happening? BNSF over here, they say that you're not doing as great. They'll just start a dialogue. They don't like it that we do it, of course, but
Yeah, well, that's not really the point, is it? We didn't ask permission. So, but I bet your members like it.
Yes, they do. And especially when they're having service problems, they like it, because you can see an uptick in the response level to the survey when there is stuff going on. We get a lot of complaints, and then we give them a venue. We give them a place where they can put in what's happening to them. Oh, yeah, the railroad did this to us, blah, blah, blah. And so we can put those remarks up. It's all anonymous. We're not saying who said what, where. We protect the identity of everyone's response. We just keep the data. And yeah, shippers do like it.
Well, if Vina from Union Pacific is going to the White House to try to increase the sense of inevitability of this merger, and Chair Fuchs can see that Trump just fired Primus without cause, which is not actually allowed and doesn't have any historical precedent. If I were a shipper, I think I'd be a little bit concerned that what happens when Chair Fuchs gets a call from the White House saying we really like this merger. What happens then? And how can and maybe it's a little bit too much to speculate about that, but how can the work that you do in coalition, and how can actually there are lots of folks in the public who care about rail and would like to see a stronger surface transportation board. I can assure you of that. How do we guard against that kind of bypassing of the process that you described, and instead actually strengthen that process without retaliation?
Yeah, well, it's tough. There are rules. I mean, we can point to the rules. And in fact, we can point to Trump's very own executive orders. He put out a bunch of orders earlier this year. One of them talks about anti-competitive policy. Like, how does this help competition? If you're standing there and saying, we don't want to do anything that destroys the competition for commerce, how does this help? And in fact, in the merger rules of the STB, this merger has to prove that it's going to enhance competition. How does it enhance competition if you're eliminating one entire railroad?
Right.
And rail to rail competition, I guess, is what we're talking about. I don't care about the rail to truck competition. They can talk about that if they want, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Right. I thought that Matt Rose's point around what happens to the BNSF to Norfolk Southern interchanges, what happens to the Union Pacific to CSX interchanges,
What about those shippers?
what about those shippers? And your shippers, I can see why, I care a great deal about trucks, and I'd love to see a lot of the ton miles that are going on long haul trucks be converted to rail. But I can see in your position, your shippers are really concerned about making sure they've got reliable rail service because they're even worse off. They don't have the possibility of shipping by truck.
We can't ship by truck, and we want reliability and we want rates that are fair. And since we're most of us captive to a single railroad, you take another railroad off the map, that's worse for other people. Now they're captive. So you have a lot of captive shippers out there that have no other way of getting their product except one single massive transcontinental railroad. Do you believe that's going to be fair? What about the service issues that can come out of that? Are they going to lay off people, or there's going to be communication problems, or just a myriad of hands-on efficiency issues that we've experienced in the past when there were other mergers going on that can gravely affect your business, especially if you're a small shipper or you have access to no other resources out there. We have to make our voices heard somehow.
And I hope that we can do it with the Reliable Rail Service Act as a bipartisan piece of legislation. So I hope we can do that. And I feel like I'm taking more time than do you have a few more minutes?
I've got a few more minutes. I would like to know, why does Trump like this, or what is it that he likes about it other than it's huge? I mean, what is it that they consider beneficial, really? I mean, most of his stuff has been really pretty common sense and fair-minded and makes a lot of sense to me. But I'm not so sure it's that Trump is liking it. He just may be like, oh yeah, that's, acknowledging it. I'm not sure there's been support, unless you've heard about it. I haven't really heard that there's been a great deal of support from the White House on this merger, other than the fact, oh great, the CEO of the railroad talked to the president or something.
Yeah. It was interesting how he characterized Vina as a real railroader, not a Wall Street railroader. But that doesn't make any sense because, of course, they're all controlled by Wall Street. We have no protections against that.
Well, apparently it's all about money. I mean, the other CEO just lost his job because he wouldn't talk about the merger, I guess, or I'm not really sure what happened over there at CSX the other day. I'm sure you heard about that, where Hinrichs, who I thought was a great guy, what was the problem? It sounds like the Gestapo walk in and demand that he do something that he refused and they just kicked him out. I mean, it just sounds pretty brutal, whatever happened there. So I imagine Patrick Fuchs might be a little nervous, but I think if he crosses his T's and dots his I's and follows the rules.
I'm really concerned about the independence of the Surface Transportation Board and how the Primus firing could actually, I'm a little curious if anybody will challenge the legitimacy of any procedures that are made without Primus participating before what would have been the end of his term. What if a shipper or a railroad decides they don't like a decision that was made and they say, well, it would have been 2-2 if Primus was there, so we don't think that this rule is actually valid. Byron Porter, who's a commentator on rail policy and rail business, referred to this merger as kind of the end game. And Bill Stevens referred to this merger as kicking the can, this further and further consolidation. And I mean, that is the history of the railroads, is one consolidation after another consolidation after another consolidation. So I wonder if there's a different paradigm for rail in the future where maybe the vertical separation of operations and infrastructure might be something that we should be striving for. That if the railroad operators were operating on, say, an open access rail infrastructure, and they were competing with service rather than with monopoly power, that might be a paradigm that we're moving towards, whether we have that aspiration or not, just with this consistent pressure towards consolidation.
Okay, so try to think beyond the current pain issues of, if this happens, would there be some way of, in the future, it completely opens up and gives you access to everything, and you don't have to be stuck with poor service if you don't want to. mean, I guess I haven't thought it would go that far, but
It might not,
those guys that write those articles, they've been in the business a long time, and that's what they do. But maybe there's a way to think about this long term. And is there a benefit, really? And is it something that could be good?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm wondering not so much that the UP-NS merger would be good, but that is there a path where they stop trying to squeeze more and more quote unquote efficiency, really what they mean is profit, from doing less and less, but instead they have to compete and grow their businesses as train operators. One of the guys that we've interviewed has a book called Toll Roads for Trains, and it talks about creating an open access system. Other people have talked about having the rail system be like the interstate system, where anybody with a truck who's got a license can get on and move. I know it's more complicated with railroads, but that kind of vertical separation between operations and infrastructure may be a consolidated infrastructure that is either public or privately owned, but is open and that people are competing with their service.
Well, yeah. Look at what's happened with companies like Amazon. You get your product the next day. You get pretty much anything and it miraculously appears on your doorstep. I mean, that was not even possible. It wasn't that long ago before that was happening. So I guess there's possibilities with automation and AI that there may be a way to make this whole thing operate a whole lot better and faster and more efficient for everyone. And that maybe it does become more of a public access type of model. And you aren't going to get punished for not knowing your volumes and your forecast, and you're not going to have to invest so much in your own infrastructure. It will be evened out and everyone can pay the same price for something. It'll be more like the airlines where you can decide, well, I'm going to fly to Boston, but instead of through Atlanta, I'm going to go this way and I'm going to take 3 airlines. So I'm going to save this much money. I mean, I don't know. I'm just spitballing here.
Right. Well, yeah, we're both spitballing here. So, yeah, but it makes me think that, wow, it's really important for us the communities like that you formed with your coalition, the conversations in those spaces around what's at the foundation of what we want. What does a better world for us look like that works for all of us? What does that look like? And then as we imagine and advocate for a rule system that's fair, that we somehow keep that in mind or keep working on what is the future that we want out of this, not just what are we constantly having to react to.
Yeah, instead of what we don't want, which is what we seem to talk about the most.
Right. So maybe you could brainstorm a little bit about if you were delving into the minds of your constituents, your colleagues, your allies, what is it they need and want out of a transportation system?
It would be great if it could work more like the gas pipeline where you just contract for capacity and then you can take what you want on a daily basis, or you have a maximum and you have a floor and you pay for that access. Something like that, where there's no more of this fighting over deliveries and winners and losers and parking trains. And I know it still has to move on the railroad, but maybe there's more of a fluidity to it where you stop wasting so much time with these contracts and these fights and these disputes and problems like that. Somehow get to a point where it's just more fluid and more accessible to more people. Because sometimes maybe you only have 2 rail cars of something you need to move. I mean, the railroads don't always like to bother with small business because if it's not big, it's not going to make them any money. Well, I think small shippers still need the product moved and they should still have access and they shouldn't be punished with higher rates just because they're small. You should have the ability to get what you want.
I mean, this whole idea of reshoring and reinvigorating American industry and communities and small manufacturers. I mean, those people were killed by the deregulation of the railroads and trucking and the offshoring and outsourcing of all of these things. And it seems like the rail system is important to people from very different political perspectives. And I think we can all see some really incredible advantages of using rail, using trains. And in a time when there's so much division, it seems to me like it's a place where we could really lock arms and get Congress to take some important steps forward in a bipartisan way.
It would be great if we could get Congress to lock arms, period. Right now, they're arm's length. The Congress doesn't want to even look at each other. But I think we didn't talk about this. I think what has kind of happened over the last several years is part of the problem is labor force. You don't have a lot of young people that want to go work on trains. They don't want to be called out in the middle of the night. It's hard to find those people. Whereas before it used to be very reliable and that, if you could get a job on the railroad, it was like you almost had to have a relative or know somebody and you could get your foot in the door and get a job on the railroad and you were set for life.
Well, it's interesting though, too. I think the labor folks would say, rail jobs used to be great jobs, but all of the pressures that you described earlier about having people overwork because they're understaffed has made them less appealing jobs. Like Union Pacific at one point, what I heard was the worst company in the United States to work for. I would love for rail jobs to be great jobs again, because I feel like we could really use a bunch more rail workers.
Yeah, they're not treated very well. I think you're right. There's a lot of issues with their pay and they have a lot more demands too. I don't really know that much about that side of it, but I do hear a lot about it. Again, it goes back to the doing less with less kind of business model. I do want to mention a kind of interesting thing you may not have heard about, but BNSF just the other day, they sent out an email to all their customers urging everyone to speak up and tell the STB their concerns about this UP-NS merger. I've never seen the BNSF do anything like that before. And now all of a sudden they're concerned about competition. In fact, the title of the email, Help Preserve Rail Competition. Your voice matters. Well, wait a minute. My voice didn't matter so much when we were complaining about this thing that happened, a couple of years ago. Where in the heck did this come from? And they're listing all these things that we should be concerned about and tell the STB that this merger is a bad idea, is what I'm getting from this email. So what in the heck? That's bizarre to me that they would do that.
No, I think it's really interesting. I saw that as well. It's like enemy of your enemy is your friend.
Most of the time they're trying to shut us up, and now they're saying our voice matters.
Right. Well, maybe we should take them up on it and strengthen the STB. Let's take it to Congress. Let's not rely on just people writing Patrick Fuchs.
Yeah, I think it should go a lot further. I'm not sure if a bunch of shippers writing Patrick Fuchs will change his mind about anything or just create more paperwork.
Having those shippers write to members of the Commerce Committee to make sure that there's a rail title in the surface transportation reauthorization, that seems to me worth the time and energy to do.
Yeah, that might make more sense. I don't see the BNSF telling us to do that, but we can do that.
Right, but we're not going to try to trust BNSF to set our strategy.
No, you can't trust them anyway.
Yeah, right. Anyway, well, Emily, I really appreciate you taking this time. It's been really interesting and a great view into the world that you operate in and navigate. So thank you very much.
Sure, I'm happy to help, and it's been fun talking to you.
I get to talk with lots of different folks from lots of different perspectives, but getting to talk with you and the coal shippers, that's really unique for me. I'm come from more of an environmentalist background, and I want you to know that even someone like me really wants to be able to lock arms with folks like yourself and your shippers to try to get a better rail system.
Yeah. Okay. Well, keep up the good fight then.
Boom. All right. You have a great night. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
That was Freight Rail Customer Alliance President Emily Regis in conversation with Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. You can find this show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.